I would like to start off this video lecture by recapping the main points of the Battle of Bull Run. The Battle of Bull Run took place in Bull Run, Virginia, just between the Confederate capital of Richmond and the United States capital of Washington, D.C. The battle took place on July 21st, 1861. The Union objective was to capture Richmond and hopefully end the war in one short, epic battle. The Confederate objective was to defend the homeland. After a few hours of fighting, the Confederates are going to reign victorious. The importance of Bull Run is that it was the very first battle of the Civil War, and that it made both sides, Union and Confederate, realize that this was going to be a much, much longer war than they originally anticipated. After the Battle of Bull Run, both sides freak out about the implications that this war is going to be longer and more brutal than imagined, but it really freaks the Union out even more. They really were not prepared to fight a long war. Most of the troops that Lincoln had drafted were only enlisted for 3 months. Lincoln decides to prepare for a long war after that first battle. He orders a blockade of all southern ports. Now, if you recall, the South is very, very, very large. And for Lincoln to effectively blockade all of those southern ports, he was going to need about 600 warships. At the time of 1861, after Bull Run, Lincoln only had 40. So ordering this blockade was really a way for Lincoln to say, we need to be beefing up our Navy if we're going to have any chance in beating the Confederates. He also called for an additional draft of 50,000 troops to build up his army because he's realizing the war is going to be much longer. The rest of 1861 into early 1862 sees some back and forth wins. The North wins some small battles, but the South continues to win around the city of Richmond, which is really important because if you remember the Anaconda Plan, there's only 3 parts for the North to win. They have to blockade the South, they have to get the Mississippi, and they have to get Richmond. And so we can see that in 1861 into early 1862, Lincoln and the Unions are having no luck blockading because they don't have enough ships, and they're having no luck beating the South at Richmond. So really these first year and a half of the war can be chalked up to a Confederate win. Also occurring during this first year and a half of the war is fighting at sea. The Civil War was the first war with modern armored warships, and these are ships that could power themselves. Before this, every other war fought at sea relied on wind-powered ships, or ships that were rowed by hand, by man. So this is the first war where actual warships are used to fight. You can see a picture of the warships they used at the time. Those were called ironclad ships. They were essentially big floating pieces of iron that weighed so much they barely stayed afloat, and many of them ended up sunk at the bottom of the ocean. This is also the first war with the use of submarines. Even though they're used for the first time, they're not very effective, and also most of them end up at the bottom of the ocean with the soldiers trapped inside. So we get this war at sea. Lincoln's trying to beef up his Navy very, very quickly. The Confederates are realizing they're going to need to figure out a Navy, and this war at sea is really going to come into play later on as the Civil War progresses. We talked yesterday about leadership in the Confederacy under Robert E. Lee, and how Robert E. Lee is one of the best military minds of America's history and the history of the world. We need to spend a few minutes talking about leadership in the Union. The Union is going to be hampered by ineffective leadership during the war. Lincoln is essentially going to go through 6 different generals until he can find one that is going to help him win. If you recall, the general during the Battle of Bull Run made a fatal error in telling a Confederate spy his plans for the war. After Bull Run, he is replaced by General George McClellan. McClellan is going to be the most famous of Union generals until Ulysses S. Grant. The reason he's going to be so famous is he has a really bad relationship with Abraham Lincoln. Basically, McClellan thinks he can do no wrong and thinks that Lincoln is the reason the Union is losing the war at the beginning. McClellan is very similar to Robert E. Lee in the fact that he is highly qualified for his position. He attended West Point, a military college, at only the age of 15, when most people attending are 18 or 19 years old. He's going to graduate second in his class, just like Robert E. Lee, and he's going to serve in the Mexican-American War, and then he's actually going to go over to Europe and fight in a war they're having. So he has lots of war experience. As a general, he leads a very well-trained and organized army. These men knew every drill, they had every supply, they could follow any command. But because he had trained them so well, he was always scared to put them into battle. He kind of had this fear that if he actually used his army, something bad was going to happen. So he was always very reluctant to actually fight, very, very slow to move from battlefield to battlefield to get anything accomplished, and he always overestimated the enemy. So, for instance, if anyone back then could have known that the Union Army greatly outnumbered the Confederate Army. But McClellan always thought that Robert E. Lee had some secret weapon in his back pocket. So he always overestimated Robert E. Lee. McClellan is going to be a big part of the Battle of Antietam, which we're going to talk about today. So we talked about all of 1861 and most of 1862, the Confederacy is winning. And really at this point, it's kind of their war to lose. They have really started to wear the North out. They're defending the homeland. And now they've got to accomplish some of their other objectives. To this point, until 1862, they had never fought on the offensive. They had only been fighting defensive battles. They decide in 1862 it's time to take the war onto Union soil. Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, orders Lee to march on to Maryland. Maryland was an excellent target for the Confederacy. If you recall, Maryland was a border state. This means that Maryland kept slaves but stayed with the Union. The Confederacy thought that if they could get a good win in Maryland, they could convince Maryland to secede. If Maryland secedes, they will take Washington, D.C. with them. So Maryland is really a very appealing choice for the Confederacy. It should hopefully be an easy win. It's close to home. They're not going very far away from Virginia. And there's lots of Southern sympathizers in Maryland. They also hoped that if they could get a big win in the North, they could convince France and Great Britain to join their side. So right now, go ahead and pause the video. I want you to write down the 2 objectives for the Battle of Antietam. They are both Southern objectives for this battle. For the South to win, they must accomplish both objectives during this battle. Their first objective is to capture the capital of Washington, D.C. The second objective is to get a foreign ally, to get Great Britain to join their side. So recap real quickly, the 2 objectives are capture Washington, D.C., and get Great Britain as an ally, Once again, they're both Southern objectives. So Lee and his troops are going to travel to Maryland. And Lee decides that he wants all of his generals to be on the same page. They've never gone on the offense. They've always been on the defensive. So Lee writes down his battle plans, and he sends them out to all of his different generals so that everybody is on the same page. Unfortunately for Lee, one set of the battle plans goes missing. Lee had decided to wrap his battle plans in cigars. So what happens is a courier is carrying the cigars from Robert E. Lee to one of his generals, and he drops and loses the cigars. A Union spy is going to pick up the cigars, not thinking anything of it other than, hey, lucky me, I found some cigars. But he's going to open them up and find Robert E. Lee's battle plans. He quickly delivers them to George McClellan. The Union now knows exactly where Robert E. Lee and his troops are going to be. Even though McClellan gets this information, he sits around for several days and does nothing with it. He's the kind of guy that if it were raining soup, he would go outside with a fork to try to catch it. So he really does nothing with this huge advantage he has. What he does end up doing is he meets Lee's army near a small town of Sharpsburg, Maryland. Since McClellan does nothing with his advantage, Lee is given the chance to get really good field position at the Battle of Antietam. The Battle of Antietam is going to occur on September 17th, 1862. To this day, it is still the bloodiest day ever fought by American soldiers. There are going to be more than 22,000 casualties at the Battle of Antietam. The Union will suffer about 12,000 of those casualties, and the Confederacy will suffer about 10,000 of those casualties. The reason this battle is so bloody is it is an army of 80,000 men going up against 30,000 of the toughest, strongest-willed soldiers. So it's really a battle between the numbers of the North and the fighting willpower of the South. This is a very, very messy battle. It's going to take place through a cornfield, trying to secure a bridge, and even on the grounds of a church. Basically, it's wave after wave of Union soldiers smashing upon a much more formidable, tougher Confederate force. At the end of the day, militarily, this is a draw. Both sides have seen casualties that no one in America has ever seen before. 22,000 men will never return home after this battle. 22,000 men lay fallen on the battlefield of Antietam. The North, however, is going to claim this as a political victory. They stopped Robert E. Lee from getting Washington, D.C., and they stopped Robert E. Lee from getting a foreign ally. So when you're working on learning targets this evening, you can consider this a political Northern victory. But for all military purposes, this is considered a draw, which is very ironic considering Lee only had 38,000 troops and McClellan had almost 80,000. So once again, the fault here is the South had the will to fight, and they fought so much harder than the sheer number of men that the Union had. After the Battle of Antietam, several major things happened. So really, there's three big reasons why Antietam is so important.